Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. While I've been at Northwestern visiting, there's been some fantastic people, very open to meeting, spending time in the Sonic Lab, spending time over in the sociology department, spending time with Kellogg. It's a great institution to have. I'm very happy to be here. So, as Nash kindly introduced, I'll be talking today about one of the chapters of my dissertation. Called How Product Ontologies Evolve. Now, before I begin, I know there are a couple of semantic web people out there, so I do want to make a distinction that when I say ontology, I'm not referring so much in the same way as say, an RDF. I'm referring more to the ontology in the philosophical sense of the essence. And when I talk about a product, I'm referring to a product category. So what the essence of a category is. So this is a definitional question. What defines a product category? And I'll be using the tablet computer. How many of you have tablets here today? I find it funny that you've got something that resembles a laptop. Oh, I'm here today. So a couple of you have iPads, I can see. But, you know, I see one in the back. Looks more like is that okay, it's not a pen. So point I'm trying to make is there are several different devices that could be called a tablet. And the question of what is a tablet is at the core of my research. So, structure of my talk today. This is a work in progress. I'm really anxious to get some feedback. As long as the questions are not too long, I prefer them during the talk. I do have a section at the end for questions, but if there are things that you want clarification on, it would be great to get questions through. I'll be focusing on some methods that I'm developing. I should say, I am not primarily a networks person. I am in the strategy and innovation group at the Saïd Business School in Oxford. And I'm basically in org theory. That's my main home. I really am getting excited about network methods, in particular expanding beyond just social networks. What I'll be talking about today is a lot of work I've been doing in semantic network analysis. This is to say, this is a form of network text analysis. This is looking into the meanings of texts. So yes, I've been working on a new method that can help answer some long-held problems within org theory, in particular in the innovation space, which is really where I feel most comfortable. So yes, my setting is the recent history of the tablet industry. It's not that old, or it's really old, depending on who you ask. And I'll be looking for evidence of product ontologies. So the context for this project. Economic sociology has had quite an interest in product categories for some time now. Product categories are extremely important in terms of defining industry, the interfaces of industry. Markets exist through categories. Supply and demand connect and interface through categories. So I'm building off of the economic sociology literature that talks about how markets are social constructions. And I'll be talking about the product innovation literature that talks about the life cycle. The life cycle being that industries go through periods of ferment, and then dominant design gets established, and then a market will, sort of converge upon a common definition for a while until it's disrupted, and then it goes through another dynamic. Many of you may know this as the S-curve. So the relationship between these two literatures I'm going to draw is the embedded in these categories. What I'm looking to do is to analyze blog discourse to find evidence of these categories emerging and, I should say, converging as they emerge. We all lead into the ultimate question of how does this discourse shape? So the argument is really based on economic sociology and the interest they have developed in product ontologies. Nash mentioned Mark Ventresca. Back in 2002, he wrote a chapter with Joseph Porak, on product ontologies and industry belief systems. And if you think about the different levels of belief systems in the market, at the very top you have reputation. Reputation, defined by various market mediators. So there's been work done by Zuckerman on industry analysts and the way that industry analysts assign values of companies based on how they fit into existing categories. So there's the ambiguity discount, as they call it, that if a company does not easily fit into an established category, it's usually biased lower in terms of its value. So in this field, there's a strong basis on network analysis. John Moore has done some really interesting work on meaning structures, looking at the shifts of discourse at a very high level. So I'm really inspired by that work. But in particular, I'm looking at answering this question of how does dominant design emerge? It's a very difficult problem. And one of the wonderful things about the internet and blogs are that we now have access to a lot of data, as well as computational methods that allow us to explore this. And for those of you who don't know that much about the social construction of markets, I just wanted to point out disruptive innovation is an example of a social construction story. That markets come to settle on performance metrics, that being the way that you evaluate a product is according to its performance metric. So when the iPad came out, many of you may have heard criticisms of it being, it's not a very good phone. I'll show you the example. You hold it up like this. It's not good for that. The affordances of its size are not that of a phone. Another criticism was that it's an underpowered laptop. And that's true. But that assumes a performance metric, being that you care about the things that a laptop does well. So according to existing categories, if you try and subsume that device into those categories, it is inferior according to the performance metrics of each. But if it has its own performance metric, then it could perhaps, let's say be superior, but it could compete on its own. So there are certain things that a tablet can do that those other two devices cannot. So the story of disruptive innovation is really one of settling upon new performance metrics. So a new social construction of what is valuable. And the example that Christensen developed in his work was that of the hard drive, whereas the 3.5-inch hard drive settled into, the industry settled into a performance metric of price per megabyte. When 2.5-inch drives came out, they could not compete on that same metric. So it was seen by many of the producers as being inferior. However, the affordances of a small hard drive allowed the laptop to emerge. So although it did not make sense on the old performance metric, on a new performance metric, it was quite superior. So that's a social construction. So the product ontology. I'm just going to sort of rush through this because I want to focus on some data, but I just want to basically say that product ontology is the essence of a category. It's made up of an array of attributes. The example in the literature that's often cited is the minivan. So we often, well, most of us probably at this point, take for granted for what it is. Early on, there was a struggle, a contest to define what it meant to be in the minivan category. And there are, in this study that Rosa and Al did in 1999, they looked at the trade press magazines and found that there were an array of attributes like car-like handling, front-wheel drive cup holders, storage large enough for a 4x8 piece of plywood. Together, the array of attributes come to define what a minivan means. But it's more than just the attributes. It's also things like use cases, the type of people that would buy, the type of companies that make it, the type of models. Together, they converge upon a set of beliefs that close around what this ontology means. Now, this has been linked to the social construction of technology literature. Pinch and Biker did a wonderful study on the emergence of the bicycle. Many of us take for granted today the design of the bicycle, but early on, this was one of, or the bicycle that we know was one of many designs competing. This was known as the safety bicycle. And through a social process, which I might remind you was not that it was the best design, but the point is that the performance metric for this one, for the safety bicycle, got constructed so that the performance metric defined this one, which was good according to the performance metric, and it was a virtuous cycle. So this has been studied before as industry ethnography, using both quality and quantity to study the emergence of this, but without access to accounts of the emergence of the category, as well as methods to handle large-scale analysis. It's been somewhat difficult to do studies on this. So I'm hoping to bring in some network methods to look at this. So Porak and Al talked about how new ontologies come about, new product ontologies come about when an inventing organization questions the dominant ontology and attempts to use it to solve new problems. In other words, as Petrosky says, they have to become ontological critics. But the critical point that they make in this is that ontologies are created by firms, and they are then pushed out and iterated within the market. So a company will try and release something, get the feedback, modify it, release something else, and then it's an iterative process. Now, what's really important is that they are externalized and reflected in market stories, texts, and documents. Now, this is a review chapter. It was written in 2002, and back in this chapter, they posed as a challenge at the end that in order to study product ontologies, one has to map the market stories. So market stories are really critical for mapping the emergence and history of product ontology. And looking for that convergence of market stories should be a form of looking at convergence towards a stable product ontology. The question that I have in this is, not only can it be studied with this series of methods, but what if it's initiated in discourse as speculation? So what if they have it not quite right in terms of this chapter? But what if these ontologies are developing as rumors? I mentioned the iPad. How many of you here heard about rumors about the iPad before Apple said it? A couple of you. I mean, this is a fairly widespread discourse. So it may be possible to infer some of these definitions in semantic networks and before the company release. So there has been some work done on the role of media in innovation discourse. Mark Kennedy did a really, really fascinating study on refraction in the media of startup companies, where he showed a U-type relationship between company performance and co-mentions. He's looking at startup companies of the, I think it was the microcomputer industry. And he found that if the media mentioned your startup company in conjunction with others, it afforded you legitimacy that dramatically helped with performance and indeed the survival of your firm. So that grouping became really important in terms of shaping the market. But of course, there was a point of diminishing returns where, although you were counted, if you were sort of just blended in with the pack, then it didn't matter. So you were discussed. So, you know, this is similar to the work that's been done by Joseph Porak. He's been really central to this work on rivalry networks. His famous study where he went over to Scotland and looked at the knitwear industry. And he asked, you know, they surveyed and did interviews with a number of the major firms producing the top quality cashmere. And he, and his co-authors, asked them to check off this extensive list of attributes that mattered to their product, but also to check off who they thought were their competitors. And through this, they found that there was a very definite cognitive network of who was competing using what. So the question that I have is to look at that and say, well, are tech blogs helping to connect the dots and group which companies get counted and which attributes get counted in which categories? So in other words, are they helping to do some of this categorization work, and especially in speculation early on? So by the time that a company releases, like Apple releases a product, is the market somewhat primed for this? So is the social construction going on a bit earlier? So I mentioned the life cycle model. Many of you probably know this, so I'm not going to focus too much on it. But I did want to point out that there's an era of ferment where you have lots of different design options competing for the definition. And then once dominant design is reached, then it becomes about elaborating that design, and it becomes about competing based on performance within that established definition. Now, this is somewhat of an evolutionary model. There have been a number of studies that have looked at, why does this convergence happen? And there are many different explanations. There's a really interesting study that Garud and Rapid did on the New York Silicon Alley industry. And in that study, they showed that, well, there never was a dominant design, and that industry was chaotic as a result. So there could be many economic explanations for this, although Intripsis in a 2008 article talks about how the forces that drive this are social, political, institutional, economic, and cognitive. So I'll be focusing mostly on the cognitive aspects of this. So going back to the tablet industry, InfoWorld released an article last July saying the iPad's victory in defining the tablet, what it means. That was an example of a claim ratifying Apple's offering as the dominant one for the industry. When we look at some statistics taken by market research firms, we see that global tablet shipments hit 66.9 million. The tablet industry is exploding. And within this, Apple, correctly, has about 60% of the market share. So there is something to be said for this. So if we go back and we say, what's a tablet? Well, contrary to what some of you might suggest, it didn't start here. This is Steve Ballmer at the CES trade show in early January of 2010, introducing a product that was called at the time the HP Slate. Now, you might notice the design looks somewhat familiar, although unfortunately you can't see closely. It's running Windows 7. So he introduces this at this show, and then a couple weeks later, Steve Jobs introduces the iPad. But Steve Jobs, with his reality distortion field, made many claims as to Apple's superior defining capability. He takes credit for the tablet, but perhaps the tablet as a concept has been around for some time. What was really interesting is I saw an article on the lawsuit that Samsung filed against Apple regarding the Galaxy Tab. Apple was suing them for patent infringement. And in that lawsuit, Samsung's lawyers brought up that the tablet concept had been around for some time. That in the 2001 A Space Odyssey, there was a version of a video-type device that you can see the image there. In the original Star Trek series, I wasn't able to find an image, but they had similar looking devices. And Xerox PARC, Alan Kay, had this prototype that they called the Dynabook. It's been around since 1960 or 72. It was never actually built, but that idea, that concept, has been floating around for some time. So another attempt at this was the tablet PC that Microsoft proclaimed was the evolution of computing. Bill Gates introduced this in 2000. It was defined, according to them, as the evolutionary step in PC functionality and usability. It was about a pen-based interface. It was supposed to be the next step of a laptop. It was to take your existing laptop and add pen touch functionality. Now, many of you may have used them, but you can all probably acknowledge that didn't really go anywhere. Kind of a niche product, not particularly mainstream. By the time 2010 came around, there were many other options vying for this definition. Yeah? Yeah, so that's right. Yeah. So there were many different options. Fujitsu was quite prominent in this with the Lifebook line. But there were many different options that had tried to come up with the appropriate way to deal with pen-based interface. Lenovo was in the game for a while. HP was in the game. Toshiba, Panasonic had a version they called the rugged tablet. But the point is, this was an era when the era of ferment really started, and then it never really solidified that. Yes. Well, it's a very good question, because the Newton, the Palm, yeah. The way I'm drawing the boundary, it may not be the best way to do this, is size. That the Palm Pilot and the Newton, yes, sorry, form factor size, yes, was most similar to phone. That I am drawing the line there. Not that much larger. It's less than 5 inches. That size matters a lot in terms of this tablet. But good question. Technologies and this trajectory and history and the tree of technology is very messy. And what's fascinating about all of this is the way that it goes from this messiness towards some level of convergence. So yeah, we had the HP Slate that I showed you the image of. I don't think that product was ever actually released. They came up with it, they announced it, and then it kind of was vaporware. HP eventually bought out Palm's WebOS technology, released a touchpad, but that was only on the market for a couple months, I believe, before they pulled it. There were several different Windows options, several different Android options. BlackBerry has released their playbook, but they've had some huge problems with getting traction. Although I think the Apple iPad really has done a number. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, they would. The way that, and this is a weakness of my study, is I'm looking at the word tablet and how that word comes to be the core definition. I think that the e-readers are a huge part of this. So I should actually include that. Okay. Okay, so yeah, the one that he introduced there. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I know, I see what you're saying. It is closer to the definition. The question, yeah, it does. It's in that, doesn't it? But yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, what I've tried to do in this study, and this is a work in progress, so I really appreciate the feedback, is I'm building out a method. I'm building out a method to try and trace these product ontologies. And the key word that I use to ground this is tablet. Conceptually, I think the tablets, as we know them in Roman design, borrowed a lot of ideas from the e-readers. And the difference between this is pretty close, when you get to the Kindle Fire. Is that a tablet? Is that an e-reader? But the question that would come from that is then, how close is the e-reader and the tablet in terms of their trajectory and their development? That is something for further study. So for this, I sampled some product rumor blogs. These are generally tech blogs, but they talk a lot about rumors of new products. Mac rumors is a really big one, specifically focused on Apple, but they do talk about the industry as well. On Gadget is a general tech blog, and Boy Genius Report is a tech blog that seems to be focused on mobility. Now, for simplicity, I'm presenting these three product blogs. As I develop the method, it becomes trivial. It is entirely possible that I have some sampling bias, but I did try and get some decent tech blogs that had sufficient activity. So what I've done is I'm looking to project a semantic network based on similarity. So I'm comparing the discourse in articles. The reason I didn't want to do just a keyword count is I wanted to get some form of relation. I wanted to get some form of the discourses around a particular product at a particular time. So slightly wider sample. This is why it's somewhat of a genre analysis, what I've done at this point. And I've done a longitudinal analysis annually, and then I've done it quarterly. So I'm basing this method off network text analysis. Back in the 80s, there was a call to enhance traditional network analysis to focus more on communication content. And then conversely, in organizational theory, Kathleen Carley at Carnegie Mellon was particularly instrumental in trying to get some cognitive mapping and map analysis going. So to combine content analysis with more relational approaches. Several approaches have been developed. Latent semantic analysis is one that was quite popular for some time. Centering resonance analysis is one that National talks about. Product Ontologies has a great piece of software looking at the between the centrality of keywords. I'm looking at the bag of words approach. So this is TF, IDF, cosine similarity. So I'll explain a little more in detail. This is something that's pretty central in the information retrieval field. And that's part of the reason why I'm really leaning on it pretty heavily. In one of my meetings this morning, another method was suggested to me called LDA. It's a good one I'll look into, but if you have any other suggestions, great for my literature review. So cognitive mapping. Several other people within org studies, cognitive strategy have talked about this. As I said, Kathleen Carley is particularly central. She has continued to stress that the weakness of content analysis is the focus on frequency in looking at concepts in isolation. But the relational components are important. Nadkarni and Narayanan did some really interesting work on cognitive mapping of collective strategy frames within industry, and I'm looking forward to that. I mentioned Korak, the Scottish middleware study, and Sarah Kaplan in her review of cognitive strategy talked about the need for this type of work. Now, in terms of my data, I mentioned my sources. I'll talk a little bit about the tech blogs. I'm going to go through the features of this data as well as a micro example of this method in action before I show you the findings. Everybody with me up until this point? Okay. So, in the last 2 or 3 years, there have been a number of studies, not that many, but kind of a handful of studies that have started to say, hey, tech blogs could be useful, could be good data sources, we need to consider. Davidson and Vast talked about how tech blogs form into a core periphery community of A-listers. Droganal talked about how they may help to set a marketing agenda. And Polak and Williams, in writing a recent issue of Information and Organization, talked about how their study on Gartner as a technology consultancy that was doing naming and categorization work on behalf of enterprise technologies. I think they defined what was that? The big enterprise technology platform? ERP, yes, they defined ERP. At the end of their paper, Polak and Williams mentioned that tech blogs could be involved in this kind of work too, that they should be looked at. So there seems to be a gap in literature here. So I think that this gap could be filled by an argument around how tech bloggers are potentially shaping these discourses. But of course, analyzing the sheer amount of that discourse is a problem. So when we see the type of data that I have here, can you read the table already? Okay. Mac rumors, all their articles, there were 14,000 articles published since 2001. Their comments are a different story altogether. There are millions and millions of comments. I think they have about 8 million. On Gadget has about 58,000 articles published since 2004. Going to Use Report has 13,100 since 2006. So it's a fairly big data set. What I have done is I've collected this data through web scraping. Basically in PHP, using curl and regular expressions. I've gone through and downloaded all these articles in their text, processed them, and shoved them into a MySQL database. I've then written interfaces in PHP for that, which I can then access from Python using JSON. I'm able to access that. I lean fairly heavily on the Natural Language Toolkit. Fantastic, fantastic piece of software. As well as NetworkX and iGraph. So in this, as I said, I'm building off of Carly's work, especially on map analysis. I'm trying to build a semi-automated computational approach. Mentioned Kennedy, working with TF-IDF, cosine similarity. There's been some related work to this coming out of University of Maryland. Ping Wang and his group over there at the Information School are looking at innovation concepts in the trade media, looking at like InfoWorld and other magazines like that. They're using multidimensional scaling. They haven't quite made the jump to networks in the way that I am, but I do think that they're going in that direction. The limitations to the study. I'm going to say this before I really get into it. This is at the level of articles. I'm looking at the similarity between articles and if they cluster in a meaningful way so that we may see salient contexts. So I'm taking advantage of natural language processing here. Not to get too technical, but the basics of natural language processing, we have stemming, we have lemmatization, moving stock words, parts of speech, parsing, and chunking. I'm not using the parts of speech at this point. I don't have a comparable corpus to really take advantage of. Parts of speech is where you're able to break a sentence down into its syntactic parts and then analyze specific parts of it. Moving stop words, like prepositions, they're not particularly important for the meaning of the sentence. I'm taking advantage of stemming and lemmatization. Stemming being a way of normalizing keywords. You know, the example I give here is that run, and running, stem. That's a normalized word. And lemmatization is where you use a dictionary, kind of like a thesaurus, to abstract several words to find their common meaning. So I'm going to go through an example of building a semantic network. So I'm using TF-IDF cosine words method. What I do is I convert each text to a word vector of TF-IDF scores. TF-IDF, as I said, is a common technique in information retrieval where you're looking at a word. TF refers to term frequency. IDF refers to inverse document frequency. It's basically trying to pull out, it's a metric for pulling out important words from a corpus. So I get a score for each word in terms of its importance, and then I construct a vector of those scores. And then I do that for each article, and I do it in n-dimensional space so that every word is accounted for. If a word doesn't appear in one document, then it gets a 0. So I compare the cosine angles across each one, each vector, and then I have a similarity score for one document to the other. So what I do is I then take a threshold value. Now, this is somewhat arbitrary because I don't really have that much of a basis to work with here, but I take this value, and any score above that value gets activated as a network tie. And the difference between that threshold and whatever that weight is becomes the weight of the tie. have some indication of the articles that are more similar still. But if anything is below the threshold, it's not even a tie. Excuse me. So this is 2009. I've sized it according to degree centrality. There are a lot of articles, and it's somewhat of a mess. That's correct. Yes. Yes. And one of the reasons I was looking for the GFIDF cosine method was I wanted to be able to compare the whole text. I wasn't just looking for the centrality of particular keywords. Yes.
So one way which you could do that demo is to try using different cutoffs and see that the network generated from the say certain things that your research somewhat will follow to the specific
Okay.
several cutoffs the result of the actual numbers doing not just stop or
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I mean, one of the problems that I have with this is if I bring it lower, then some of that information gets embedded within the weights. So then, in terms of like this graph you see right here, is quite dense. So that it might be too low in terms of to have any sort of meaningful interpretation. So one of the ways that I've dealt with this is I applied some community detection algorithm that tried to partition it because it didn't have a clear idea of components or cliques within this network. So when I apply the Newman eigenvector community detection, I get a much better sense of what the network looks like. Now, one thing I had to do is filter for edge weight. So this is, again, perhaps this problem of that threshold being if I have to filter, meaning I'm only displaying ties above another threshold, I'm just raising it again in terms of getting that meaning. So yeah, maybe I wouldn't have to do this step if I had done the sensitivity analysis in the first place. But okay, you can see here that we start to get a pretty good idea of clusters of stories here. Now this is over a full year. Now you can't really tell from there, but that's a cluster that talks about Apple products. When we zoom in on it, we see an interesting array of. And what I've done here for the title, or for the label of the node, is I just took the first 20 characters of the page type. Now, it's interesting as a visualization, but analytically it becomes really difficult to say, well, what does that actually mean? So what I tried to do was aggregate the semantic content of clusters to get a decent idea of what is it that ties them together. So using the assumption that titles are a proxy for what the article is about. I think it's a fair assumption, but has its problems. I have two algorithms that I worked with here. The first one was to just take the titles, filter the stop words, stem each word, and then run a frequency distribution and return the 5 highest. Very crude. Kind of goes against the logic of relational, but I'm struggling a little bit to find the right algorithm for figuring out how to aggregate that content. The LDA, I'm told, is a really good method for that. Do you have any other suggestions? I'd like to know. The other one that I did here is I filtered the stop words, I gathered the TF-IDF scores for each word and titles, and then I did a frequency distribution. Or not frequency, I returned the highest of those scores. So I don't know if you can see that data here, but I'll have to just tell you. These two nodes, two clusters, were in 2009 were around Apple and the conversations that they seem to be having with magazine publishers. So what I've done here is broken the cluster up and found the individual articles, what site it came from, degree centrality, and between this centrality, to try and get an idea of, do you have an article that is somewhat central in its meaning, or a connecting type article in its meaning? But the results that I'm able to pull from this are that in 2009, there were two very clear clusters. And this method seems to be demonstrating appropriately that these clusters are about, if you can see, the cluster keywords are Apple. Of course, this is STEM, so it's word APPL. We have to take as Apple. Publish, content, digit, magazine, and tablet, Apple, digit, future, magazine. The articles within do seem to adhere to that theme. But the idea that I'm trying to get at here is this semantic grouping evidence of an important aspect of developing product ontology? The first, sorry, yes, I used the first one. This is just the frequency analysis after they've been stamped. So when I do this by year, I see five major clusters formed per year. And you can see there's a clear explosion of articles in 2009. In 2007, there are 208 articles that mention tablet. In 2007, there's 208. 2008, there's 224. In 2009, there's 489. Keep in mind that the iPad and the HP Slate were announced in January of 2010. Previous to this, HP was involved with producing tablet PCs, but they were not in the Slate market. And there were no Android tablets, or at least mainstream Android tablets on the market in 2009. So if we were to look at 2009 as a breakout year, at least with the discourse, we see Microsoft is there, Android is there, the CrunchPad, there's tablet, Apple, and there's Nokia involved in this. So I think the method does give a pretty good indication of what's being said. Now what I've done is I broke it down into quarters. Now again, unfortunately, this is a table that's quite dense, so I'm going to have to step you through it because you can't read it. But I noticed in looking through this that several of the clusters that popped up had fairly low network densities. That perhaps there were further subclusters. So I ran the analysis through again and found one more level of subcluster. And this is where the table is showing, the first cluster that comes from each quarter and then the subcluster within. And in most of the subclusters, the network density goes significantly higher, indicating that that cluster has high semantic similarity. So I'm able to look at these tables for 2007, 2008, and 2009. And at this point, what I'm attempting to do is to try to tie these results into some form of a meaning structure. And there are many ways that I could do this. I'm looking in particular at trying to trace frames of discourse around these products. In particular, when you see, in the 2007-2008, a lot of talking about tablet PC. There's the variants of this being the tablet PC convertible. Now, this is simply from looking at those labels that I pulled out from the clusters. You see rugged tablet PC, I see convertible tablet PC, I see Fujitsu popping up all over the place. I see some discussion of the rugged tablet PC popping up. And I see some evidence of the netbook popping up. And again, this is before, was it ASUS? The AEEE PC was the first netbook. There's some discussion about this before the product was actually released. So, looking at product ontologies, there is some discussion about attributes around these products that are appearing in these clusters. But I need to find a way to link them together in an efficient way so as to say a product ontology is converging. So I am able to see that 2009 is an important year for the tablet industry. It's when amplitude goes up, but it's also when there's a lot of variation. The frame shift, as I said, from talking about a tablet PC and talking about pens to talking about multi-touch. Ostensibly, that's an interface question. Some tablets, Android tablets, started to be released in 2009. What was interesting for me, looking at this, I've been doing this project now for about 2 years. I had no idea that there were Android tablets that were being sold in 2009 that resembled the iPad and the Samsung Galaxy. These were released by small startup companies. They were reported on by these tech blogs. They were not reported on by any of the. I did searches and couldn't find the New York Times talking about Genie's Movit Mini Wi-Fi Android tablet. And yet it's very similar. It's remarkably similar to what Samsung introduced a year later. So these blogs are reporting on small companies releasing products, and they're keeping some of these concepts going in the discourse. So we see that the mobility frame is stressed over the laptop frame by 2009, and the Apple tablet conversation heats up. It's not that any of us really thought that Apple wasn't going to release a product in January, but looking at this data, you get a pretty good indication for what it's going to be called, what it's going to look like, how it's going to be used, and other aspects of a product ontology. So, in terms of where I'm continuing to go with this, the role of speculation. I may divide up these articles in terms of which ones refer to speculation versus which ones refer to released products. And I'm particularly interested in still looking at how much consensus is formed before these major products get released. So, what have I showed you here today? There is a semantic network. There's a hierarchy of these articles, of these clusters. And these blogs are indeed grouping the products, the product concepts, in particularly meaningful ways. The next steps are perhaps building the data set into 2010, when ostensibly it really exploded. I collected the data for this and found that there are 1,200 articles that were published in 2010 that refer to the tablet. This is up over 400 that were 470 something that we're talking about in 2009. And I'm looking for perhaps proper structural metrics for considering these networks. These are not social networks, so it's hard to really say social networks. But I find it's meaningful looking at a semantic network. And also, this links to the other chapter that I have in my work, which is referring to the importance of communities versus issue publics, the more classic sociological domain. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.